Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. The Bar Standards Board, that is the BSB, is proposing a new duty on the barristers that it regulates. The duty, in short, is to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion when practicing or otherwise providing legal services. The BSB says this duty is necessary to address certain failings at the bar, including unequal outcomes, especially in recruitment, failure to address harassment and bullying, and a failure to create an inclusive culture. What we will be discussing tonight, in summary, although we will see where the discussion takes us, is the following. Are the BSB proposals justified by fundamental principles of equality and representation, securing access to the bar that represents the demographics of the country, and also, of course, access to justice? Or, on the other hand, do the BSB's proposals go too far? Do they mandate agreement with contentious principles and risk putting words in the mouths of barristers? Do they potentially compromise the independence of the bar? The Free Speech Union will be making its own submission to the BSB consultation, and we invite others as well to do the same, particularly legal professionals. And the deadline for the consultation is the 29th of November. And the FSU is also commissioning counsel's advice on the legality of the proposals. However, the purpose of tonight's debate is not to set out FSU's position, but to present a range of views on these proposals. And we're very lucky and very grateful to be joined tonight by a panel which will very much help us to do that. Immediately to my left is Purnima Karunaka Dacharan. Purnima is the policy manager at the BSB for equality and access to justice. She has been leading the drafting of the new equality rules, and she has also been ensuring that equality, diversity, and inclusion is embedded in all areas of BSB regulation. She has over 20 years of experience working in the charity sector and as a consultant for public sector organizations on equality and human rights issues. Next to Purnima is Akua Reindorf KC. She is a barrister at Cloisters Chambers, specializing in employment discrimination and human rights law. She is well known as the author of the Reindorf Report, an investigation into the alleged no platforming of gender-critical external speakers at the University of Essex. She is also a visiting senior fellow at LSE Law School and a commissioner of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And Akua is talking tonight in a personal capacity. At the end of this row is Lord Ken MacDonald KC. He's a former Director of Public Prosecutions and one of the country's leading criminal, regulatory and international lawyers. In 2007, Ken was knighted for services to the law, and in 2010, appointed to the House of Lords, where he sits as a crossbencher. He was a visiting professor of law at the LSE from 2009 to 12, and has been a member of the University of Oxford Law Faculty since 2012. He is chair of the Orwell Foundation, president of the Howard League for Penal Reform, and was warden of Wadham College, Oxford from 2012 to 2021. And finally, on the screen behind us here, joining from Canada, is Lisa Bildy. Lisa graduated from Western Law School in Canada in 1993. In 2017, she launched a campaign to challenge the Law Society of Ontario's Statement of Principles, believing, in her view, that it was not for a regulator to dictate lawyers' personal principles. This resulted in the Stop SOP campaign, or Stop SOP campaign, which succeeded in getting elected to the Law Society lawyers who were committed to repealing the requirements. Lisa subsequently worked at the Calgary-based Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, and she now works to further the cause of defending civil liberties and individual freedoms in Canada. Finally, Lisa is a member of the Board of Advisors of FAIR, which is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and is a bencher of the Law Society of Ontario. Those are the introductions. Thank you very much to our panel for joining us. That is the introductions. Purnima, I was wondering if we could begin with you to give us an account of the proposals and what they are trying to achieve, in your view, and why we should support them?
Thank you, Bryn, and thank you to the Free Speech Union for inviting me to be on this panel. We published our equality rules proposals, the consultation, at the start of September. And it's important to make clear that these are still proposals. We are consulting. We'll be consulting on these proposals until the end of November, until the 29th of November. So we do invite a range of views and submissions to respond to these proposals. It's important to point out that we are still very much in listening mode. None of this is set in stone. But what we are proposing is outcomes-focused rules. So this is very different to our current equality rules. We acknowledge that there have been improvements in the bar when it comes to promoting equality, diversity, and inclusion. But barriers still persist within the bar when it comes to recruitment, promotion, retention, bullying and harassment persists within the bar. And these are the types of things we are hoping to tackle together with the profession. So we have proposed outcomes-focused rules. And as part of these proposals, we are also proposing to introduce an outcomes-focused positive action core duty. So changing core duty 8, which is currently a duty not to discriminate. And we are proposing a positive action duty for barristers to act in a way that advances equality, diversity, and inclusion. With the equality rules, we have set out the outcomes we want to see achieved. And this is not about having achieved the outcomes, but about taking reasonable steps towards meeting those outcomes. And we have set out prescriptive or specific requirements, and these are only specific requirements where it is necessary to create accountability and transparency and to provide a framework for the profession to be able to meet the outcomes that we have set out in the general equality rules. Now, the equality rules only apply to the self-employed bar, not to the employed bar. And the rules are very outcomes focused, and we felt that the core duty should reflect this outcomes-focused positive duty that is within the equality rules. And this standard should be set across the both the self-employed bar and the employed bar. We do understand that the self-employed bar is quite unique in that it doesn't have the same types of governance structures that exist within the employed bar. And we are hoping that what we are proposing would provide a framework to support the profession to be able to meet the outcomes that we have set out. So the outcomes are around eliminating discrimination and advancing equality of opportunity in recruitment, retention, and promotion, preventing harassment and bullying, and having processes in place that prevent that type of behavior, ensuring access to services, and promoting an inclusive culture. The specific requirements that we have set out are around collecting and analyzing data and setting action plans that are specific and measurable to tackle the disparities that are identified through analyzing the data that is collected. When we talk about acting in a way that advances equality, diversity, and inclusion, what we largely mean is what we have set out in the equality rules. However, this only applies to the self-employed bar, whereas the core duty to advance equality, diversity, and inclusion would apply to both the employed and the self-employed bar. I think I'll stop at this point to allow enough time for discussion, and looking forward to hearing views on our proposals.
Thank you very much, Purnima. If I can just quickly ask a question, and I hope I'm not preempting Akua and can in doing so. Would you be able to say a bit about the existing law that already applies to barristers and barristers' chambers? So they're already under duties under the Equality Act. Just for to assist the audience and also perhaps to get a sense of where the BSB is coming from, would you be able to set out very briefly what those existing obligations are and why the BSB thinks they need to be supplemented with these new proposals?
I think it's also important to clarify that we are not bringing in, we are bringing in new rules, but currently there are equality rules in place. Under the Equality Act, barristers should not discriminate, they should not harass, victimize. So that is the Equality Act. But under the equality rules, under our current equality rules in the handbook, we do have a requirement to collect and analyze data on sex, disability, and race. We have requirements to publish an action plan. We currently have requirements that are quite similar to the positive action requirements that we are proposing, but our current proposal starts from the outcomes and then thinks about what requirements need to be in place to create transparency and accountability, and it extends those requirements to the other protected characteristics as well, not just sex, disability, and race, for example. And so barristers currently do have those, in a sense, those positive action obligations, even under our current rules.
Excellent, thank you very much. Akua, could we please go to you for a response to Punninga's helpful opening statement? If you could turn your microphone on as well, please.
Right. Okay, you want me to do an opening statement? That's fine. Yeah, I have some considerable concerns about this proposal, which I'm afraid haven't yet been allayed, but hopefully in further questioning we'll get some more answers. My principal concern is about the new core duty, the duty to act in a way which advances equality, diversity and inclusion when practicing or otherwise providing legal services. Almost every word in that is contested, and I don't know what they are meant to mean. I don't know what is meant by equality, diversity and inclusion, not least when the consultation document offers definitions which are very, very woolly. Equality is described as equality of opportunity in recruitment, retention and progression. That sounds like something to do with what happens inside chambers, not something to do with what happens when I'm providing legal services. Diversity is described as ensuring that the profession is reflective of the population. So again, that doesn't sound like something to do with my practice, but something to do with my chamber's organisation. And inclusion is about creating a respectful environment and culture, which, I would struggle when cross-examining, I have to say, to do that. And it is then also said in the consultation document that the EDI is more than the sum of its parts. So these definitions are offered as sort of individual definitions of the words, but then it is said it's more than the sum of its parts and it's a set of values and behaviours. I have no idea what that is meant to mean, other than that it sounds incredibly ideological, and it sounds very much to me like what is being aimed for is a particular version of EDI, which is not something which has universal approval or consensus. We know there are lots and lots of people who are wildly opposed to what they call DEI, having taken that order of letters from the American version. Lots of people on the right, I'm not one of them, but I still have, from a different political perspective, a concern about the version of EDI which currently is advanced through sort of human resources professionals and so on. I fear that no account has been taken of conflicting rights. The Equality Act currently balances rights in quite a careful way. It's a 200 or something page, I can't remember how long it is, it's a very long act. And our current duty is to act in a way which doesn't breach the Equality Act, which seems to me to be perfectly adequate and to be welcomed. And I just have to say I don't understand what the new duty is. And I know that solicitors have it. I don't know how they're getting on with it, but they don't have a cab rank rule, and that is a very, very key point as well. We haven't heard an explanation of how this is supposed to intersect with the cab rank rule. There is mention of clients, how we engage with clients from minoritised ethnic backgrounds is mentioned. I don't know what is meant by any of that. I mean, I could go on, but I think I've used my time up, and I'll pick up other concerns that I have in questions for Purnima.
Thank you. Okay, yes, no, that's perfect. Thank you very much. So, Purnima, I think what we'll do is perhaps if we just take some notes there from Akua's very interesting comments, and then come back to them after Ken has given his thoughts. So, Ken, if we could turn to you.
I just want to quote from the consultation document that the Bar Standards Board issued in relation to this. It says, under Core Duty 8 in the BSB handbook, barristers practicing or otherwise providing legal services, quote, must not discriminate unlawfully against any person, which is a very clear statement, which everyone understands. We're lawyers, we all know what the law is, we all know what unlawful discrimination is, and we're told that we mustn't discriminate unlawfully against any person. That's an entirely reasonable duty for barristers to have set before them. The BSB wants to replace this with a new duty that states, quote, you must act in a way that advances equality, diversity, and inclusion. In other words, you have to promote, actively promote these, these qualities, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And this is an expression, equality and diversity and inclusion, which has taken on a particular ideological meaning, first of all, in the context of US racial politics, and as it's seeped over the Atlantic in Europe as well. The consultation document goes on to say, and by the way, I should say, in the way it's understood in the context of US racial politics, it's highly contested. It's highly contested across the political spectrum, not just on the right, but amongst liberals and indeed on the left and in the centre. The consultation document goes on to say, it is important that every barrister sees this as a duty that applies to them in their professional role, and that the BSB is able to take action against behaviour which works against equality, diversity, and inclusion. So this is a statement that the BSB must be able to take action against behaviour which, in my judgment, is part of a contested ideology. It goes on to say, the current core duty requires barristers not to discriminate unlawfully. However, in order to achieve the culture change needed, we believe the duty needs to go further. We believe it should be a core expectation of all practicing barristers that they demonstrate an appropriate commitment through their practice to equality, diversity, and inclusion. An appropriate commitment, again, to what I would regard as a highly contested ideology. It goes on to say, this will form the basis of our future regulatory action in this area and will be central to achieving behaviour and cultural change across the profession. So the BSB obviously see this as a radical change, which is expected to achieve cultural and behavioural change across the profession in requiring people to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. So my central objection to this is that it looks very like the promotion of a contested ideology, which will mean that barristers who don't share that contested ideology will potentially be subject to disciplinary proceedings. But I want to identify it in another way, because I think the focus on outcomes is illustrative of something that's happened in the United States over the last 5 or 10 years, when we've begun to constantly hear, in place of the old word equality, we now hear the expression equity. And everyone from President Biden downwards no longer talks about equality, but they talk about equity. So it's essentially equity, diversity and inclusion. And what's meant by equity? Well, equity, the idea of equity is a shift from the concept of equality of opportunity to the concept of equality of outcome. That's what equity means in US racial politics terms, the demand that outcomes should be equal. Now, it seems to me that in order to achieve equality of outcome, you have to be relying on some form of coercive process. You have to be relying on quotas, which I know the BSB isn't talking about because they'd be unlawful in the UK, but there has to be some form of coercive process to achieve something as extraordinary, if you think about it, extraordinary as equality of outcome. And I rather fear that this whole project on the part of the BSC is part of an echo of that shift that's occurred in the United States around racial politics, from an emphasis on equality of opportunity, which everybody, who could possibly disagree with equality of opportunity? Everyone should have a fair crack at success. A shift from that to this far more controversial concept, so-called outcomes-focused concept of equality of outcome. And I personally, although I probably would describe myself as someone of the left, I'm strongly opposed to the idea of enforced equality of outcome. I don't subscribe to it as a philosophy, and I would feel very uneasy if my professional regulator somehow required me to show loyalty to an ideology that was based around that concept. And I think there's a lot of concern at the bar that that's what's happening here. This is part of a shift. It's not just going from what is described as a negative duty to a positive duty. And indeed, I don't think that being required not to discriminate unlawfully is really a negative duty. It requires you to behave in a particular way, which is to obey the law. But I think this shift from that to the injunction that we should promote EDI, which in itself is focused on outcomes, is an indicator to me that that's the road we're going down, and I think it's a very undesirable one.
Thank you very much, Ken. I thought it might be helpful, Purnima, perhaps, to pick out a few things from Akur and Ken's comments to see if you can help elucidate them, or if you wish to push back on what Akur and Ken are saying. I mean, first of all, if there has been some robust pushback. I mean, there was an interview between a representative of the BSB and Joshua Rosenberg, who I thought gave a fairly confident sort of pushback against some of these challenges. Can I ask, when the BSB was preparing its proposals, was it aware that it may prove as contentious as it has?
We, within the BSB, reflected on these proposals quite a lot, and we gave it a lot of thought. There is quite a lot of discussion within the BSB as well. We are not coming from a particular ideologically driven approach. Within the BSB as well, we are giving careful consideration to these proposals, thinking about whether they are proportionate. So in terms of whether there would be pushback, I suppose, yes, we did expect a certain amount of pushback, but something we also realized is that there was a certain amount of misunderstanding on what we were proposing. For example, the cab rank rule, for example, what we are proposing would not impact on the cab rank rule. There is no, we are not saying that barristers should not represent a client whose views may be considered to be contrary to equality, to the promotion of equality, diversity, and inclusion, for example. This does, what we are proposing doesn't in any way impact on the cab rank rule.
Sorry, could you briefly explain just very quickly what the cab rank rule is, just for anyone?
Yeah, so I think Akko might be, for example, in a better position to explain this than... yes, go ahead.
It's pretty simple. It's just that barristers are required to take the work that is offered to us as long as it's within our competence and we're available and it's properly remunerated. We can't turn down clients on a basis that we don't like them or don't agree with them or think they're wrong.
Thank you, Akwa. So what we mean by these positive action duties mainly around practice management. It doesn't extend to cross-examination or doesn't impact on the cab rank rule or anything like that. So as Akwa rightly identified, when we talk about equality of opportunity and we are talking about recruitment, progression, retention, for example, that is to do with practice management. When Ken mentioned sort of that this is ideologically driven, that it is about equity. So taking an outcomes-focused approach is very much about equity. Within our proposals, we are not referring to equity in any way, and that is not where we are coming from. And we are not proposing that the profession should have achieved those outcomes or demonstrate that they have achieved those outcomes. It's not about setting quotas, about positive discrimination, because as Ken pointed out, that would be unlawful. What it is referring to is positive action. So what we mean by that is very much largely set out within the equality rules, which we then go on to set out sort of around equality of opportunity in recruitment, retention, progression, preventing harassment and bullying, and having processes in place to do so, and so on.
Akua.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just still really confused by the use of the words when practicing or otherwise providing legal services. That's what really is the key problem for me. What is meant by that? There's no explanation of it anywhere in the paper or in the rule, and it seems extremely broad and extremely likely to conflict with the cab rank rule.
So what we mean by that is that it doesn't look at a barrister's non-professional life. And we are not referring to, for example, what happens on Twitter or social media, etc. This is very much about what happens within practice management.
But then why doesn't it just say in practice management rather than when practicing or providing legal services? Because providing legal services is not what I do when I'm managing the practice.
But that's a very interesting point, and that is something that we will take back and reflect on when we analyze the responses to these proposals. I suppose one of the problems of purely defining it around practice management would be that when it comes to, for example, not discriminating, that would apply to to providing legal services. So the core duty is not taking away that duty not to discriminate. It is expanding on that duty and saying you must act in a way that advances equality, diversity, and inclusion, which also includes the duty not to discriminate.
Well, I mean, that's a legal duty, so there's no need really to set it out, is there? I mean, and also, it's not the same thing. I mean, not advancing EDI is not the same thing as not discriminating for the reasons that Ken's already set out.
I mean, I think my concern with the broadening of this ideology has practical, real-world consequences. I mean, one of the things that I'm most concerned about in this whole area is the question of women's sex-based rights, which again is a highly contested issue. I mean, some people think that those who speak to promote women's sex-based rights are transphobic bigots who shouldn't be allowed to work and shouldn't be allowed to speak. And the courts have said that those are beliefs and views which are worthy of respect in a democratic society and good for the courts. But one of the problems about expanding this sort of ideology into barristers' daily lives is that people will rely on EDI ideology to attack other people who don't share that ideology. And I can quite see disputes arising in chambers and complaints being made to the BSB and all the rest of it, precisely along those sorts of ideological lines. And these are, in the context of legal practice, entirely fatuous disputes, which are going to take up a lot of time and money. I mean, I can imagine saying things in the context of a barrister's chambers which are, for example, gender critical, and other people in those chambers or outside those chambers taking the view that by saying those things, I've not only failed to promote EDI principles, but I'm speaking in conflict with EDI principles, and this is a disciplinary matter. And we all know that once a complaint has been made, all us barristers know that once a complaint's been made against you, you enter a nightmarish hell of bureaucracy and form filling and worry and concern and all the rest of it. And this will just become possible in this area of kind of political belief and disbelief. And I think that's really dangerous road for us to be going down, frankly.
Sorry, I see people have got their hands up. We're going to do Q&A at the end of the session, but sorry, I have clocked those who had their hands up, and I will return to you. So apologies for not being clear. Akur, do you have something you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Ken just said, because I mean, it's interesting what Ken said about gender critical people in chambers and how that might work in the context of this EDI scheme. And I just wondered, Punima, if you could comment on that, because we know that there are people who adhere to gender identity beliefs who consider that the mere existence of those with gender critical beliefs is an existential threat to them and is undermining of their dignity.
And their identity.
And their identity and their existence. I mean, that's why I said existential. Yeah. So, you know, how, when a person is facing the possibility of having action taken against them by the BSB for behaviour which works against EDI, which is what it states in the consultation paper, you know, how are you going to manage those sorts of conflicts of rights, and which are currently very focused on the protected characteristic of belief in the Equality Act? And I mean, I'm sure you're well aware of the, you know, huge growth in litigation in that area and the very, very difficult conflicts of rights which occur. And the same thing could be said in relation to, you know, Israel-Palestine, which is another hot button issue at the moment. You know, where you have people whose beliefs are not only contrary to each other, but actually are experienced mutually or from one side as a threat.
Well, can I just give one practical example? I just want to give one very quick practical example. So David Panic and I wrote a letter to the Times right at the beginning of this conflict, saying that Israel had the right to defend itself, and we had multiple complaints made against us to the Bar Standards Board that we were encouraging genocide. And that's just one example of how this sort of thing, that complaints can become radicalized. And that, for us as barristers, that is a real pain. It's a real pain to have to go through that kind of stuff.
Okay, so quite a lot of incoming there, Punima. So first of all, I mean, what is your answer to the charge that this is going to lead potentially to lots of vexatious complaints, or bring in the regulator into discussions that shouldn't really be any of its business?
So I think these types of complaints are already being made, and they are carefully considered, considering human rights and our public sector equality duty. We don't expect that this would necessarily increase the number of complaints coming through, because even under CD5, many of these types of issues can be brought. We have a process for taking a risk-based approach to considering whether we have a regulatory interest in something and whether we take regulatory action. So what this new duty does is that it sort of clarifies the standards and expectations more. We don't believe it will necessarily increase the number of reports being made. However, we are very keen to hear whether, for example, our proposals could have an equality impact on those who share particular protected characteristics. And we are very open to hearing views and evidence on this in response to our consultation.
And can I ask just to bring out something that Akur and Ken were both touching on? So there's some concern about alleged vagueness of some of the terms. So to take one example, which is a duty to promote these duties. Now, how far do you think a duty to promote goes? What degree of commitment, to use the word in the proposal, is called for?
So largely what we expect is what we have set out in the proposed equality rules. So these are duties to collect and analyze data disaggregated by protected characteristics and socioeconomic background, to really reflect on that data, to identify any disparities, and to think about what actions can be taken to address those disparities. Then to set specific and measurable action plans to address those disparities. So this is the type of positive action that we would like to see, and that is what we are proposing. So what we mean by a positive action duty is largely set out in our equality rules.
And so forgive me, this is my own ignorance here, but obviously what you're describing there sounds like a duty on chambers in terms of how they manage practice. But the promotion duty is also on individual barristers, am I right?
So all of these proposed rules and the core duty, there are duties and obligations on individual barristers because of the nature of the way the self-employed bar is organized. The duty is on individual barristers, not on chambers, because we don't regulate chambers, we regulate individual barristers. So the duty falls on individual barristers, both the core duty as well as the proposed equality rules.
Okay.
I mean, the difficulty, I think one of your difficulties is you are dealing here with barristers. And if you're going to...
You are difficult to deal with, as we know.
Yeah, if you're going to put in a rule with this kind of wording, I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine somebody in chambers complaining that their colleague who does a run of cases where they represent gender-critical clients and win a series of successful outcomes which move the law forward, is acting in the course of their legal practice in their provision of legal services in a way which works against diversity and inclusion, because to their mind that will be something which will put, you know, people who are in favour of gender identity theory off coming into their chambers and put trans people at large at a disadvantage in society. That will be their view. You know, with this kind of wording, it's wide open to a challenge of that sort. It really doesn't say anywhere in the wording of the core duty, or indeed in the consultation paper, that this is limited to sort of these administrative types of, or public sector equality duty types of things in practice management. I think the very, very least you need to do is to restrict this to practice management, and then think carefully about how that trickles down to being a duty on individual barristers. I mean, how are you going to, will you take action only against behaviour which works against EDI, or will you also take action for, you know, people, say somebody sitting in Lincoln's Inn doing their shipping practice and not thinking twice about EDI? Will you take action against them for failing to do anything to advance, being too lazy to advance or uninterested to advance EDI?
So enforcement action would be a last resort. That is not what we are looking to do. We are looking to work with the profession to move the dial on EDI. So the first point of contact would be with supervision. So supervision would provide the support needed to barristers on meeting the requirements set out under the proposed equality rules. So we would expect to see barristers taking a reflective approach. So this duty, these requirements apply to each individual barrister. However, some barristers will be more accountable than others depending on the roles that they take on within chambers. But delegating away duty doesn't mean that the barrister can say, oh, this has been delegated to an EDI officer within our chambers. It is their responsibility. So I have got nothing to do with it. Barristers do need to think about the governance structures within chambers, how they delegate responsibilities, how these requirements are met. That doesn't mean micromanaging those who have been delegated those responsibilities, but that also doesn't mean delegating and not thinking about it any further. So it might involve thinking about it annually, looking at how these requirements have been met.
I'm going to quickly jump in. So we do want to bring in Lisa, who's been waiting extremely patiently. Thank you, Lisa. Just in 5 minutes, we'll go to our video call with Lisa. Just to, and apologies if I'm in fact misrepresenting your line of questioning, but as I understand it, what Akura is trying to get at is you've got these very broad duties that apply to barristers in the various hats they wear. And so what are the safeguards that prevent the duties from increasing or sort of spreading to include the bread and butter of their legal practice? How do you ensure that the duty only bites on those activities that you really want to capture? What are the safeguards? Is Akura in fact wrong that there are safeguards to prevent this sort of mission creep? And do you think on the basis of this feedback, there's a call for them?
So we would definitely take on the feedback that we need to clarify more that this relates to practice management, for example. The safeguards are our internal processes when it comes to handling reports, thinking about whether there is a regulatory interest in something, whether there is a need to take enforcement action. So we are a risk-based regulator, so we would think about what are the risks, and think about issues around proportionality in taking enforcement action. So those are the safeguards that are there. We would also provide extensive guidance on what we mean by our proposed Core Duty 8. But still, just to emphasize that this is all very much at proposal stage. We are only consulting on these proposals, and we are very open to hearing where there might be sort of equality impacts, or where there might be issues in the drafting of the words perhaps, or where there is need for further clarification. We are very open to hearing your views on this.
Akura, Ken, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still interested in understanding the answer to the first question that I asked about gender critical people in chambers and how they might be challenged. But I take on board what you've said. I have noted that in the duty or in the consultation paper, it is said that barristers will have to demonstrate an appropriate commitment through their practice to EDI. I mean, again, if this is about practice management and not practice, then why does it say that?
We will take that on board, and we will clarify that going forward, yes.
All right.
I think we have also issued some statements. We have set up a frequently asked questions website, which states that this is very much about practice management and doesn't impact on the cab rank rule, for example.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question which relates to the public sector equality duty, because this feels like something which is sort of similar to the public sector equality duty, but for barristers, I don't know if that was what you had in mind when you were doing it.
So what we have statutory duties under the Legal Services Act to encourage a diverse profession. We have duties under the public sector equality duty. And in order to meet those duties, to advance equality of opportunity in recruitment, retention, promotion within chambers, for example. That's not something we can do. That is something that has to be done by barristers within chambers. So we do need to set certain requirements that require barristers to take that approach.
No, that's not quite. Sorry, it's just not quite what I was getting at. What I was thinking was, are you sort of modelling this in some way on a type of something similar to the public sector equality duty? Are you trying to sort of extend to barristers something along those sorts of lines? Because it just strikes me that the public sector equality duty is a much lower level of duty on public sector organisations to pay due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination and so on, which is much, much less onerous than this duty, which is to take reasonable steps to promote EDI. That's what says in the rules or in the consultation document, although notably not in the wording of the duty itself. So, I mean, the duty itself says you have to advance it. The consultation paper says you have to take reasonable steps to advance it. Those are already contradictory statements. And then, by comparison to the PSED, I think it seems even the reasonable steps level of commitment seems to be much higher than what is placed on large public sector organisations, which is to pay due regard to a need to eliminate discrimination. So I don't know why it's set so high.
So we weren't necessarily modelling it. Sorry.
No, that's all right. If you just briefly, then we'll go to Ken, and then we'll go to Lisa. That's all right.
Sure. So we weren't necessarily modelling it around the public sector equality duty, but I see what you mean there. I'm not sure whether the duty is necessarily higher than the duty to have due regard. Because even when you look at the public sector equality duty, there is the duty to meet those specific requirements around publishing equality information, etc., and considering that and demonstrating how you had due regard to the general duties. But what we are trying to do is it's more of a positive action provision where it requires thinking about what are the barriers, and then thinking about what can be done, what positive action can be taken to address those barriers.
I mean, I'm quite struck by the point that Aqua's just made. I mean, if the public sector equality, it seems to me it is clearly a lower duty. To have due regard to something is a lower requirement than the requirement that you act in a way that advances EDI. And I mean, if that's right, it seems to me to be completely wrong that there should be a higher burden put on barristers in private practice than there is on the public sector. I mean, when I was running a college in Oxford, once a year we had to remind everybody about the college committees about the public sector equality duty, and we ran through it so everyone understood it. It's like a big thing, you know. You have to every year go through it in all the governing bodies and the other committees of the college so that everyone who's on the committee understands what the public sector equality duty is. And it's clearly a lower burden than this. And I'm just surprised that the BSB hasn't, if it wants to introduce a new rule beyond the requirement not to discriminate unlawfully, which seems to me to be entirely sufficient, if it wants to introduce a new rule, why didn't it introduce a rule that was precisely on a par with the public sector equality duty? Why do they think it had to go further?
I don't think this duty necessarily goes further than the duty to have due regard, because we do say you must take reasonable steps to achieve those outcomes. So what is required is to demonstrate that reflective approach of taking reasonable steps. I know in the core duty we haven't mentioned take reasonable steps, and that is perhaps something we need to go away and consider in.
I think the use of the word advance is very unfortunate because it implies that you should be proselytizing it for it, arguing for it, debating for it, pushing it. I mean, a requirement to advance EDI is not the same as having regard to EDI. It suggests that you have to become an active propagandist through your work for EDI, and that's really problematic because I don't want to. I don't want to be a propagandist for EDI because there are parts of it that I strongly disagree with. And as I said before, I really object to the idea that I should be potentially subject to disciplinary proceedings because I'm not prepared to propagandize EDI. So I think you really need to look at the word advance. I think it's a very, very unfortunate selection of terms.
It may also be indirectly discriminatory, contrary to the Equality Act, just against people who hold particular beliefs, like who don't believe in EDI. I mean, that may very well be a protected belief, and if it is, I mean, I'd be surprised actually if it wasn't arguable with good advocacy that that was a protected belief. Or that believing in EDI was a protected belief, and so the absence of it is also protected under the Equality Act. And if that's the case, then this duty is indirectly discriminatory, and you'd have to show justification, which I think you would struggle on the current material that we have.
Thank you. So if I suggest that, perhaps if you come back to those in your closing remarks, we'll go to Lisa now. It might be difficult to defend yourself against the claim that ACUA has clearly started drafting against this, but maybe have a think about it. So, Lisa, if we can go to you, thank you so much for your patience there. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you very much. So I was just wondering if you could kindly tell the audience here about your own experience against a similar proposal from the Ontario Law Society.
Happy to. So first of all, I'll just tell you that I'm speaking to you tonight from London. That's London, Ontario, a city of about 450,000 people, 2 hours west of Toronto. And yes, our local river is called the Thames. We were the copycats. Something else we have in common is that our legal regulators have decided that we needed to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in order to be lawyers. Here, your country is the copycat. We've already been there and done that, as they say. And I was asked to share our experience with you tonight. I've prepared some remarks which are hopefully not redundant with the excellent points raised by my co-panelists. And for reasons which will become apparent to the story, I'm now a member of the governing body of our regulator, the Law Society of Ontario, and I wish to confirm that I'm not speaking on anyone else's behalf but my own, and all views expressed are mine and mine alone. So let me give you the background to our EDI initiative in brief. Nearly a decade ago now, on the basis of a very deeply flawed report, which has been taken apart by some statisticians, it was riddled with methodological deficiencies and obviously motivated reasoning. The Law Society decided that it had found what it went looking for, which was systemic racism in the profession. In December of 2016, benchers, which is the quaint name we give to the governors of our Law Society, unanimously passed 13 recommendations designed to address this systemic racism. And this unanimity was achieved largely through intimidation and bullying, as we learned a little later on in the process. So among the recommendations were measures that were designed to, quote, to ensure better representation of racialized licensees in proportion to the representation in the Ontario population, in the professions, in all legal workplaces, and at all levels of seniority. Okay, then after going on about how important these measures were to addressing racism, they then immediately voted to extend those same recommendations to all equity-seeking groups. These groups were not defined or limited in any way, nor was there a comparable report offered even as a pretense to indicate why this was necessary. By that very action, the Law Society confirmed, to me at least, that this exercise was not about addressing racism at all, but about requiring lawyers and paralegals to swear allegiance to progressive values as a condition of practicing law. Now, in order to get lawyers on board with this accelerated culture shift, as they called it, it was necessary to moderate their thinking. To that end, a mandatory statement of principles was part of the package to which each lawyer and paralegal needed to sign. So the specific language was this: the Law Society will require every licensee to adopt and abide by a statement of principles acknowledging their obligation to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion generally, and in their behavior towards colleagues, employees, clients, and the public. You are required to confirm on your annual report your personal mission to promote equality, diversity, inclusion as defined by the Law Society in your practice, in your personal life, and even in your retirement. That's how broadly that was drafted. These would prevail over any conflicting principles you might personally hold, of course, because If you didn't indicate on your report that you had complied, there would be progressive discipline, presumably through to the suspension of your license to practice law. You could either sign the requisite statement without believing it and be a hypocrite, or you could refuse to sign it and risk your career. So requiring people to swear, in effect, a loyalty pledge or litmus test to a particular political view is unsettling at best and totalitarian at worst. One advantage to the UK bar doing this in 2024 rather than 2016 is that more people now understand that those nice sounding words demand more of us than first appears. And they don't automatically assume that opposition to them is grounded in hate or bigotry. Now, as lawyers, you would think that we would want to have clear definitions of terms before we agree to anything. But activists in this space would rather you didn't think too hard about these words, and they are subject to change. Look at the word equality, for instance. The definition on the Law Society's own webpage at the time confirmed that they did not mean equality of opportunity, or that each individual is equal before and under the law, the core tenet of a liberal democracy. No, they mean substantive equality or equality of outcome, which means that notions of merit, achievement, hard work, and talent are disparaged in order to ensure that everyone ends up in the same place in society. Now, in 2024, we don't mince words so much anymore, and everyone just calls it equity. And our regulator, including along with most institutions, at least in my country, now treat equity as though it were a foundational value in Western society, rather than equality, which is its complete opposite. The word inclusion is also fraught, as my co-panelists have spoken to, and as many feminists and gender-critical people have found out now that male-bodied individuals self-identifying as women are increasingly entering their sporting events, prisons, and change rooms. If the Law Society here had its way, no lawyer would be able to take a case arguing against this sort of inclusion because it would come up against their regulatory obligations, particularly if a proper defense of the client involved advocacy and media, as my work in this gender-critical space does. Furthermore, the Law Society's Inclusion Index, one of the initiatives that accompanied the Statement of Principles, but which has been temporarily shelved thanks to pushback, would have required firms with over 25 lawyers to answer questions on the racial and sexual makeup of all members, which would be published and ranked. If inclusion means in proportion to the numbers in society, then this is really an adjusting of shares. Some will, accordingly, be excluded in this definition of inclusion. Diversity does not necessarily mean diversity as normally understood. It means people who share a singular political view, which is rather patronizingly assumed based on skin color. Those who do not agree with this radical worldview, but who happen not to be white, straight, or male, will quickly be cast out. And now we're seeing decolonization as a new add-on to EDI, at least in academia, which means it'll be everywhere shortly. This also goes to show the political nature of this agenda. In 2017, when this initiative began to be rolled out, a few people started speaking out or writing about it, myself included, and a small group of concerned lawyers here in London Junior launched a website and took out ads to inform the profession about the Statement of Principles, or the SOP. We called ourselves the Stop SOP team, and we put a list of supporters up on our website to assure other concerned lawyers and paralegals that they weren't alone, and to encourage them to refuse to comply with the Law Society's edict. A legal challenge was also launched. Despite these efforts, more than 97% of lawyers and paralegals checked the box on their first annual report in the spring of 2018, indicating that they had prepared a SOP as required. This was before the penalties kicked in. Many told me that they felt they had no choice and were afraid to rock the boat. Large firms put pressure on their associates to fall in line. Now, I do think that dynamic and that environment is changing since 2016, 2017, and 2018. At that time, though, with the next bencher election about a year out, our Stop SOP team decided to run a slate of candidates who would endeavor to repeal the SOP. We collected donations from supporters, held a workshop to bring people together as we built our slate. We accessed the media, put out a number of articles about this, did an educational email campaign, etc. The team worked tirelessly to get their candidates elected. And on May 1st, 2019, the election results were released. Every single one of Stop SOP's 22 lawyers was elected with top votes. 19 incumbents lost their seats. Countless people wrote to us afterward to thank our team and express relief that they could continue practicing law. To say this was an existential issue for some in the profession is not overstating the case. Following their election, and I didn't run then, I just managed the campaign behind the scenes, the Stop-SOP benchers managed, despite not having an overall majority of votes on convocation, which is quite large, to get rid of the obligation to promote DEI. But the rest of the package of initiatives remains, and the Law Society appears to have doubled down. The last election in 2023 saw a coalition of candidates in favor of DEI win all the seats. They appear to have had a professional campaign manager, and with big firm backing and pressure, they did get the necessary votes. Now, as some of those people are appointed to the bench by Justin Trudeau's progressive government, several of us who were defeated have now been called up to fill the vacancies, myself included. The Law Society has now put out a governance overhaul proposal just in the last week to ensure that, to basically ensure that the Law Society governance is much more controlled, and that some people like me and a Stop-SOP team like we had in 2019 can't darken the halls of power again. So there's more conflict on the horizon as they try to push through yet another sea change. All right, so where did the impetus for imposing a compelled statement of principles, very similar to what's being proposed here, where did that come from? Well, it stems from the increasingly widespread teaching of critical theory in universities over the last few decades. Critical theory is essentially the idea that all human interaction and discourse must be filtered through a power lens in order to rectify perceived historical wrongs. It's a zero-sum game where identity groups are split into competing teams of oppressors and oppressed. One group is assigned virtue, another unearned privilege. Individual circumstances are irrelevant. In an article written 25 years ago now in the Boston College Law Review about the offshoot critical race theory, which got its start in U.S. law schools in the 1980s, Jeffrey Pyle wrote that critical race theorists attack the very foundations of the classical liberal legal order, including the notion that every person is equal under and before the law, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. These liberal values, they allege, are mere social constructs calculated to legitimate white supremacy. The rule of law, according to critical race theorists, is a false promise of principled government. End quote. So here's a message for those on the regulatory side. Is it really worth it to politicize your organization like this? You will have opposition and division, be tied up in the courts, and lose credibility with a growing segment of the population that sees through these nice-sounding words and now understands this for what it is, a political agenda. I respectfully suggest that this is not serving the public interest, but it serves a small special interest group of activists that has managed to influence policy. Think about some of the buzzwords being used to promote your initiative: outcomes-oriented and principles-focused, but only certain progressive principles. How does this work in an adversarial system? How do you have equity in a court battle? Why is it outcomes-oriented rather than evidence-based? Does the oppressor-oppressed lens override evidence? Is the outcome of a court case therefore preordained? Think back to the Jeffrey Pyle quote about upending institutions, and you may have your answers to those questions. How is the regulator going to enforce this without broad overreach into the speech and conscience rights of professionals? What if you say something on X that shows your support of equality over equity? Will the regulator be taking you to task? Well, they don't sound like they want to now. But my advice to those of you with concerns is don't let this pass. Consider it a Trojan horse that will usher in a radical reshaping of your profession. Shakespeare didn't say, first let's kill all the lawyers because they were overbilling, but because they were the last line of defense against tyranny. Those are my comments. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think now if we go to Q&A, one thing that I would say, there's been fairly little, a lot of accusations that EDI rests fundamentally on contentious ideas. Hasn't been much discussion of whether in fact it has a basis in more traditional ideas of access to justice and equality before the law. So hopefully we might be able to even things up a little bit in the Q&A. I think we're going to scoot around with the microphone. Is that right? So the sort of UN-style microphones don't work, we're told. So we're going to bring a microphone to you. If I can go in the order I first saw people. So we just take questions one at a time at the moment, and maybe see if we group them together later. So we start with Greg Callis at the back. If you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Greg Callis from Management 5RB. I'm very grateful for you coming to help explain some of the proposals. And in that spirit, I've got a genuine question rather than a comment. You said that for the most part, that this was about practice management. And I'm very pleased to hear that the qualification about being legal services is that this isn't about personal life or speech online. That's very reassuring. But just focusing on the distinction that Aqua's so clearly delineated between are providing legal services and practice management, it strikes me as interesting that there is already a core duty about practice management. It's core duty 10. And you aren't suggesting that that's amended to include promotion of EDI. It's the replacement of non-discrimination, which strikes me as odd. You also said that the reason that it wasn't just bringing in new equality rules, but was to bring in a new core duty 8, was to affect the employed bar as well as the self-employed bar, because obviously the employed bar don't have the practice management issues. So it seems to me that there is at least some scope for this new core duty being proposed outside of practice management. Can you give me an example of how the new core duty could be breached outside of practice management in a way that isn't currently caught?
Thank you.
I don't think we can sort of give that type of hypothetical scenarios. But what I would say is that largely what we mean by the proposed core duty is what we have set out in the proposed equality rules, which is mostly about practice management, but we also talk about ensuring access to services, for example. I suppose what I've asked about the duty not to discriminate, that would apply outside of just purely practice management. So there is that duty not to discriminate when it comes to sort of working with clients. So
that's already covered.
Yes.
What would the new duty affect outside of practice management that the current core duty 8 doesn't?
There isn't really. I mean, what we are proposing currently is what we have set out in the proposed equality rules, which is largely about practice management.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This isn't going to turn into a pylon, by the way. I don't want all questions against.
Yeah, we can answer. We can take questions.
So if some of you can have a pop at Akur and Ken, please, that would be most welcome. If we go to Beth Grossman, please, and then Sarah Phillimore afterwards, and then we'll come back to the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to pick up on this point about the cab rank rule, which came up between you and Aqua. You said very helpfully that this doesn't apply to the cab rank rule. And whilst that's welcome, I think it's a concern for a number of people in this room that that is not clear and there is an overlap between practice and these rules, and there is an ambiguity as to how it applies. But I want to emphasise that the danger to our practices and the integrity of our practices from this ambiguity goes beyond that, because the cab rank rule says, as Aqua says, that you may not refuse work because you find a client objectionable, subject to competence, capacity and remuneration. But important areas of work are not subject to the cab rank rule. That is conditional fee agreement work, direct access work, work without a solicitor, pro bono work, that is work for free, and what is sometimes called low bono work, that is work where you get some money, but not at what might be deemed proper remunerative rates. Very often, clients come to members of the bar who are deeply unpopular people. Very often they are people whose causes and whose litigation would not be considered to advance equality, diversity, and inclusion. And as currently drafted, the rules provide us with the space to take that on, not through the cab rank rule, but because twinned with the cab rank rule is a duty of non-discrimination. And that is very important for those of us who are criticised, whether by other members of the profession, in the media, on Twitter, by lay people, by other clients, for the work that they take on. And moreover, the link between practice and practice management is not a hard boundary. For example, I may choose to promote my practice, including my willingness to take on those very unpopular cases through articles on my chamber's website or similar. And I raise this not to start a pile-on, but because of a deep concern that the necessary protections for the integrity of this profession have not been properly considered, because it goes much further than the cab rank rule. And that assurance, although welcome, does not answer the issue.
I think that's beautiful, Nima.
So thank you for that. We will definitely take on board that feedback, and we would very much welcome written responses to our consultation as well, setting out those concerns, which we will definitely consider as we analyze the responses to our proposals. So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that the cab rank rule doesn't fully sort of provide that safeguard in terms of ensuring that barristers can take on cases that may be considered unpopular, and they may face criticism for taking on those types of cases, and might be potentially seen as contrary to the proposed duty. Is that?
No, it's more than that. It is that the cab rank rule is but one aspect of a carefully drafted set of principles that protects the integrity and our ability to take on deeply unpopular cases, and sometimes to do so at personal risk. That the line between practice and practice management is a porous area. And I am not saying that the Bar Standards Board exists to insulate us from criticism in the public domain or in criticism or elsewhere, but as a regulator, it should properly exist not to facilitate vexatious disputes which arise in consequence of that. And my concern is, I am really grateful, and I say this sincerely, that you have said that you will take the feedback I've given on board. But I am very concerned that these points are not points that the regulator has been alive to already, given that the scope of different ways in which barristers obtain instructions and also promote their practices is long established and has not been the subject of significant change in more than a decade.
Can I respond? Yeah, I mean, we can all pack up and go home now. Beth's spoken, because it was brilliant. That really summarised quite really a couple of really important areas. And I think one of the things that we have to remember when we're thinking about the fact that these rules, that what Paul Nima is helpfully telling us here today doesn't seem to align with what's actually written in the rule, is that these rules were passed by a committee which is made up of silks. I mean, we can assume, were alive to the ambiguities that are inherent in the wording. And it's not, I mean, it's barely even ambiguous. It says that in our legal practice, we are to act in a way which advances EDI. And it does seem to me to have been entirely overlooked that, the purpose of the cab rank rule is to uphold the principle that everybody has a right to legal representation, which is, a vital underpinning of our profession. Solicitors, who are also subject to this duty, aren't subject to the cab rank rule. They don't have to uphold that principle. It's absolutely core to how we operate and why we operate in the way that we do. And I also think it's incredibly important what Beth said about being protected from vexatious, or just not even vexatious people, but from complaints about what sort of clients we take on. Because at the moment, we can say, when we take on an unpopular client, we can say, I'm doing this because that's my job. And now if we're going to be subjected to some regime of acting only in a way which involves representing good people and not bad people, or could be argued to be that kind of a requirement, then we're in real trouble.
Thank you. Just a response from Ken, and then we'll go to Sarah Phillimore and then John Holbrook.
I agree with everything you said. I think you summed it up. I just wanted to make a process point, which is this group of silks that advised the BSB, I think, was it 4 of them? Two of them were from one set of chambers, which I know very well because I was there for 20 years, and it's known throughout the bar for being a highly politicised set of chambers. I'm not suggesting for one moment that they came to this with closed minds, but it seems to me a bit unfortunate that the BSB is going to set up a panel of silks, 4 silks. It should take 2 of them from one set of chambers, which has a very particular reputation in this area. I think that was an unfortunate thing for the BSB to do.
Thank you. Sarah Phillimore.
I want to thank you very much for coming, because I don't think anybody is here tonight because we approve or applaud these proposals. So the questions are going to be directed at you. So thank you. I wanted to take it just back a step. This is on the basis that EDI is an unalloyed good and we're all for it. I, as a disabled barrister on the Western Circuit, have a visceral contempt for EDI because I see it as empty and performative. Every day I go to work, I go to a court building which is actively hostile to somebody like me with a mobility disability. I don't know a single other barrister with an amputation on the Western Circuit, and I haven't met one in 30 years. So my starting point is I have a contempt for EDI. I don't think it solves anything or does anything. You are starting on the basis that it's this unalloyed good. I appreciate this might be quite a selfish concern. You may not be able to answer it tonight, but I think it's certainly something the BSB need to reflect on. You've already spent 18 months investigating me, and that I would suggest was a waste of everyone's time and money. I've written a piece on my Substack a few weeks ago, which was entitled Why I Am Repulsed and Outraged by EDI. And I would like the reassurances of the BSB that that is not something for which I'm going to be subject to disciplinary action if complaints are made. I would consider that certainly protected political speech. And although you have reassured us tonight that what you're focusing on is recruitment and bullying and harassment, when Mark Neal was interviewed by Joshua Rosenberg, he said that that is only the primary purpose of this new duty. So I need to know what the secondary and tertiary purposes of this new duty are, and if they will apply to me. My Substack article's now been read by 4,000 people. I'm emphatically not ever going to be advancing EDI. I see it as an obligation upon me to continue to argue against it, as I think it's pernicious and dangerous. So the very starting point of your consultation is open to question, and I really hope that you will go back with those reflections. As has been repeatedly said by the panel, the wording of your consultation does not say this is limited to recruitment, retention, bullying and harassment. You're talking about me as a barrister. And I was told, and quite rightly, I'm always a barrister. Whatever stupid thing I say on social media, I say as a barrister, and you have an interest in regulating me. So selfish as it may appear, I'd like a very particular answer to that question. I am going to continue to object to EDI being enforced upon me. am I going to be able to be a barrister?
Would you like to answer?
So thank you for that feedback, and we'll definitely take on all feedback. And as you rightly said, it's not a question I can answer here. However, in any reports that are made, Article 10 rights are balanced with sort of all other sort of issues. So we would, with any complaint or any report, we would take a balanced approach. But Article 10 rights are qualified rights, as you know. But the purpose of this duty is not in any way to prevent people from expressing views, to holding views and expressing views. It's very much about advancing equality of opportunity, creating an inclusive culture, making sure that everyone is able to reach their full potential within the profession. So as you rightly said, I wouldn't be able to, I mean, everything falls on the facts of the case, on the specific facts of the case, and it will be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Just before we go to John's, sorry, go on.
I was just going to respond to Sarah's gauntlet. As characteristically thrown down a gauntlet to the BSB on this one, and taking one for the team there, Sarah, again. I mean, I just don't see how the BSB can fail to discipline you if they proceed with these proposals, given that it expressly states in the document that the BSB is able to take action against behaviour which works against equality, diversity and inclusion. If you're going to publish something that says I'm repulsed by EDI, then frankly, I mean, I'm not remotely for a moment suggesting that this is contrived, Sarah, but no, I'm sure you genuinely believe in what you said. But I mean, frankly, it does shine a light on what the conceptual flaws are in this policy.
And it's worth pointing out that Article 10 free expression rights can only be limited where such limitations are, quote, necessary in a democratic society. So the BSB would find itself in the position of having to argue that it was necessary in a democratic society to prevent people from expressing allegiance to or support of EDI principles, which strikes me as illustrating quite nicely the Orwellian position in which we would find ourselves.
Well, quite. And also political speech is incredibly strongly protected. You know, the justification that would have to be shown would be very, very strong. And I can't see where you'd even begin. I don't know even where you'd find... Well, you would maybe be able to find legitimate aim, but where you'd find proportionate means, I've no idea.
We are running short on time. Before, John, we go to you, is there anyone in here who'd like to ask a question who is in favour of the proposal? Sarah, I wouldn't put you in that camp, but is there anyone here who would like to ask a question? So if not, I will put one to Kent. So there's, I mean, it's not just yourself, Kent, but many people have been saying that these proposals are ideologically derived, that they owe their provenance to a peculiar American discourse. But I mean, are these not fairly old-fashioned and good left-wing arguments about a highly elitist, closed profession, a profession where elitism, particularly sort of socioeconomic elitism, is very dangerous, given that it remains the sort of provider to the bench. So, I mean, are we not overstating the extent to which these are sort of extraneous or alien borrowings, and that in fact there's a very, very good reason why we need to be extremely careful about equality at the bar?
No, well, I don't disagree with that at all. And I mean, when I started at the bar, it was an extremely closed profession. It was basically full of public school boys, and I emphasised public school and boys. I mean, there were, most chambers, if they had any women at all, had one. Barristers were all white, mostly white, and overwhelmingly from public schools. But the point is that principles of equality of opportunity and various pieces of legislation, the Equality Acts, I suppose, being part of that, but also the change in social outlooks, the development of a more multicultural society, have all combined to make the bar look, I mean, unrecognisable compared to what it was years ago. Of course, the bench is still pretty white, less male, but pretty white. But the way to resolve these issues is not, in my view, through equity, and I think that's what this is really about. I think it's a genuflection to principles of equity, and the idea that you achieve fairness amongst groups or sections of society by enforcing particular outcomes is not any kind of left ideology that I would recognise outside Animal Farm, frankly. And I think that's effectively what this is. This is a sort of Orwellian vision for separating people into a multitude of groups and then enforcing a particular outcome based upon those groupings, and a preconceived notion of how those groupings should be represented in the outcomes. And I don't see that as being a left of centre or a liberal view of the way the world should be organised at all. I think it's essentially is a totalitarian view and would lead to totalitarianism. So no, I don't think this is the right way to achieve a fair and open profession.
I mean,
It would achieve the opposite.
Yeah, can I comment on that as well, Bryn? Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't object. I agree with everything that Ken has said, and I don't object at all to the sorts of equality rules that we've been subject to in chambers over the years, which I think have contributed to the change. I mean, I have more protected characteristics than you could shake a stick at, frankly. And so, it works for me. And it has worked for me. I've managed to rise in the profession, and, I'm sure I wouldn't have had the opportunities that I've had were it not for some of the interventions which have been brought in through our regulation over the years. That said, some of it, what I will say about it, when I briefly was the Chamber's Equality Officer, not that I addressed my mind to it with very much rigour, but, some of the exercises that we were required to undergo, where data collection and looking at data and so on, were useful and helpful. But my chambers is predisposed towards this sort of thing, and so we welcomed it and we've worked with it and so on, and that's been good. And we work very carefully in my chambers to improve equality of opportunity. I mean, there have been changes like the pupillage forms these days come without any sort of protected characteristic information on them at all. We don't get sex, age, anything indicating socioeconomic background, etc., apart from what school someone went to, which is unavoidable. So, yeah, that's great, but this is on a different level. This is a different kind of thing, and I think that it may be that there's a blind spot within the BSB over this, or something about sort of not seeing what the qualitative difference really is between that sort of Equality Act-based sort of approach to matters of anti-discrimination and equality of opportunity, and this new breed of EDI, which is something which is of concern to people across the political spectrum. And I think that really needs you need to go back to first principles looking at this and thinking about it. And I think it will be an absolute disaster if it's implemented in anything like the form that it is currently written.
I mean, I think Sarah's statement has been as powerful as anything we've heard this evening, because it goes to the heart of it. This is not, underline not, an uncontested ideology. You cannot simply start from the basis that this is an unalloyed good, as you put it, that everyone subscribes to. They don't. I believe everyone subscribes to equality of opportunity, and everyone subscribes to the view that we shouldn't discriminate against people on the basis of all the protected characteristics that have been discussed tonight. But this is a step beyond that,
And it also
and it's contested.
Also, it does state the protected is not limited to the protected characteristics in the Equality Act plus socioeconomic status. So goodness only knows what protected characteristics we're supposed to be advancing in respect of EDI.
I'm going to jump in. Sorry, we do need to wrap up. What I suggest, there are three more people. If you can ask very, very quick questions, which then can be addressed in closing statements from the panel. So if you can make sure that they're questions, not comments. If you go John Holbrook, and then if we take questions as a three, then the lady on the right behind Toby, and then the gentleman in the black shirt. Did you have your hand up, sir? Yeah.
I think the issue the BSB is addressing here, which goes under the words practice management, is that you think that there is a problem because if you look at a lot of chambers, there's a disproportionately low number of some ethnic minorities and some women. And statistically, I wouldn't dispute that that's true. And I'm sure, you endlessly collect the statistics, so I'm sure you can establish that. But the reason why I have a problem with this whole approach is because a lot of barristers say, that's not because of me. And politically, that's a perfectly legitimate position to hold because they're not refusing to recruit someone because he or she is black or female. They are simply recruiting on merit. And the outcomes, which you constantly talk about, mean that there is this disparity. So a lot of the people in this room, quite probably the majority, if not all, certainly a lot of the profession, think, look, we don't discriminate, we comply with the Equality Act. It is not down to me that there are these disparity of outcomes. And I want you to see, as the BSB, that you are wading into a highly contested political argument and taking sides in it, because you are telling those barristers, honest members of the profession, that they are wrong. Because you are saying, and this is the approach of the critical race theorists and the critical theorists in general, you are saying, you think you're not discriminating, but you are because of your subconscious biases. You're subconsciously racist and all of that talk. Okay, so that's the political argument that you are wading into and taking sides. And you really need to think about the harm you are doing to yourselves as a supposedly independent regulator and the profession as a whole, and you spoke about one of the objectives. As you know, there's many objectives. You spoke about one part of the fifth limb, namely the need for it to be diverse. It also talks about the regulatory objective of it being independent, strong, and effective. You're undermining that.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm a family solicitor, which is why I really wanted to ask. I was hoping that there would be some reassurance tonight. So I would like to know how you will reassure solicitors that the clients that we consign to barristers, with our fingers crossed, that the thought that those clients can no longer expect, even the unlovely ones, because an awful lot of my clients as a family lawyer are pretty unlovely people, that not only are they vulnerable to a barrister having political views about them and what they're like, but even if the barrister that you've selected doesn't think that way, their opponent may decide, and they're vulnerable to their opponent making similar complaints about the way that they've run the case. As a solicitor, that's a massive concern to me. We put a huge amount of faith in barristers when we send our clients off to them, and it would be heartbreaking to have to stop. I can't cross-examine for toffee apples, so I don't quite know what I'd do. That's what barristers are for. But it really does concern me what I've heard so far this evening. So thank you.
Thank you. I've never thought of consigning someone to a barrister, but that does... I quite like that idea. So if you can go to the gentleman.
Apologies for being an interloper. I'm a documentary maker and have no legal training. But as I look into this topic, you've talked about data a lot, and once people get past the sort of fuzzy bromides of wouldn't this be nice, and you drill into the data, it seems that DEI schemes don't work. They don't work for minorities. They can often be quite counterproductive and create new forms of discrimination. I'm just curious, is there any sector where you look at the data and say, this has been a roaring success?
Thank you. So thank you all for your questions. We're now going to do closing statements. And if you can address those three questions in your closing statements, that would be very helpful. Can we start with you, Lisa, first, please? And we'll go in reverse order and end with Purnima. Lisa, a closing statement from you, please, and as quick as you can, if that's all right.
Oh, sure. I wasn't expecting a closing statement, but I'll just say, I think that the regulator does need to kind of go back and consider all of these points. It really has taken on a different flavor than it did in 2016 when our Law Society was going through this. I think at that point, perhaps people thought of it in a much more benign sense, that those words were truly going to be beneficial. But the last question was exactly on point. There really is no data to show that this works. And there would be by now. I mean, this has been going on for a decade. Why isn't there? And why are so many companies and corporations and so on dropping it now? It's not effective. And so it has a political purpose. It ensures that everyone is on the same page politically, and those that aren't will be sidelined. That's the only explanation for it that I can see at this point, a purpose for it. So, and I don't think that's an appropriate purpose for a regulator.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Ken, if we can go to you for closing statement.
Yeah, I think your question was absolutely spot on. What's the evidence base for a lot of this? I mean, I don't know whether any of you have done unconscious bias training and all the other forms of training that are available. I mean, I've done them in about 5 different contexts, and I didn't find any of it particularly helpful, and the other people I was doing it with, people of all backgrounds and races and genders, didn't find it very helpful. And I looked into it a year or so ago, and the only academic research that seems to have been done on these programs indicates that they are at best neutral and at worst actually provide some sort of established basis within people's minds for the sorts of differences that they're supposed to be overcoming. In other words, they are positively destructive. There was quite a big survey done by Harvard University into some of these programs, which came to the conclusion that they were actually unhelpful rather than helpful. I don't know about EDI programs in workplaces as opposed to training programs, but I'm not aware of any data to show their positive impact. But my other feeling about this, and this really confirms something that Lisa just said, is I think the tide is going out on some of this, and I think the BSB is a bit late to the party, frankly, and I think they're jumping on a bandwagon which is slowing, if not going into reverse. That's my sense, and I hope they think very, very carefully about this, because I think they're introducing themselves into a whole world of pain.
Thank you. Akua?
Thank you very much. My view is that any positive duty to advance anything more controversial than, the idea that the sky is blue and water is wet is anti-inclusive inherently, because it doesn't include people who don't subscribe to it. It excludes people whose beliefs and ideas about how the world works and how the world should work don't fit with the orthodoxy, and that's a very important exclusion. It goes to the root of what is supposed to be achieved by anti-discrimination and and pro-equality work generally, because viewpoint diversity is not just an add-on to EDI and to anti-discrimination. It's really at the core. The whole reason why we want diversity is because people come from different walks of life with different ideas. It's not just because people come from different walks of life with different colours of their skin or different genitals. It's because you have different experiences, different ideas, different viewpoints of the world. It is all about viewpoint diversity, and freedom of speech is an inherent part of that. If you're going to have a positive duty to advance this narrow ideological view of what, and I take on board, Purnima, what you've said, that it isn't ideological, but I maintain that I think what the BSB has done is not examined closely enough how ideological these ideas actually are. Any requirement to take that on is going to be destructive to the very foundation of what it's meant to be achieving. And so, and this is very, very often the case when people talk about inclusion, and inclusion in the document, the consultation document, refers to everybody feeling comfortable type of thing. And everybody will not feel comfortable, because people who don't agree with it will feel excluded. So it's already an enemy to itself. I think it's also likely to be unenforceable. I think it may very well be unlawful, and it needs to be. I think you need to start again with this. I'm afraid. So, but from that, go back to square one. Go back to where you started, which was duty not to discriminate, which is anyway in the law, and we are all, as Ken says, capable of understanding that.
Thank you. Purnima, you've been given rather a lot to respond to this evening. I don't expect you to be able to do it in the 2 minutes or so that remain, but if you could please have the last word.
Thank you. It's been really interesting hearing your feedback on our proposed rules, and we will definitely consider all the points raised very carefully. I would also encourage everyone to submit in writing your response to our proposals, and we will carefully consider all responses. The only thing I would like to do in these closing remarks is just to clarify a couple of points quickly, just so that when you do respond to our consultation, you are aware of what it is exactly that we are proposing. I understand that we haven't in certain situations been clear enough on what exactly it is that we are proposing, and that is something that we will take on board and clarify and provide guidance on. But I would like to clarify the point that we are not coming from an ideological point of view where it is about equity, where it's about having achieved certain outcomes. We're not saying the bar needs to have achieved these outcomes. We are coming from very much from the point of view of equality of opportunity, to taking reasonable steps to advancing equality of opportunity. To preventing bullying, harassment, etc., and having processes in place to do so, to create a culture that is inclusive for everyone. And this is not a proposal to exclude beliefs, views that are considered to be unpopular. It is very much about creating a respectful environment where all barristers can practice from and achieve their full potential. And that is where we are coming from with these proposals. It would be also interesting to know whether, if the wording to the core duty is changed to taking reasonable steps to advancing equality, diversity, and inclusion, whether it would make it better. I'm seeing many people nod their heads saying no, it's not going to. We are once again keen to hear more about your views on this. Please do submit your responses in writing. A couple of you mentioned sort of DEI schemes and asked questions about evidence of these schemes working. Something I also want to clarify with regards to this is that we are not being prescriptive in terms of what should be done to achieve equality, diversity, and inclusion. What we are proposing is a framework that creates accountability and transparency, and for that we do have evidence that that has worked. We have chambers who have come to us and said, when this data has been collected and analyzed, and when we have created that transparency using this data, we've found things changing, because transparency is huge when it comes to promoting equality, diversity, and inclusion. So we do have evidence that that is something that does work, and that is what we are proposing in these rules, which is to create that transparency and accountability, to collect and analyze the data, to really reflect on that data. Think about what is causing these disparities. It's not coming from any particular ideological point of view. I think the research is there that shows that some of these historical inequalities persist, that within the bar, people who share particular protected characteristics face disadvantage within the bar. So these proposals are trying to work with the profession to provide a framework to get the profession to take a reflective approach. And that is where we are coming from with all of this. And we are not aiming to exclude diversity of thought. It's very much about promoting an inclusive culture where there is that diversity of thought. Those are my closing remarks, just to sort of, when responding to the consultation, to bear in mind our policy intentions behind what it is that we are trying to achieve together collaboratively with the profession. And on that note, we would very much like to hear further thoughts on our proposals. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I just clarify quickly, you mentioned, Purnima, that the BSB might clarify what it meant in the guidance. Would that be clarification before the consultation deadline? Which obviously would be helpful in a way, I suppose.
What we could do is, in our frequently asked questions website, we could consider some of the points raised today and see whether we can provide any further clarification on those points. And then we would be providing guidance. And of course, guidance is not mandatory. So what we are proposing is in sort of these proposals, in this wording. And what it is doing is trying to create that framework within which to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you indeed for the reminder, of course, that anyone can make a response to the consultation. I do encourage people to do that, and maybe to do that instead of haranguing poor Purnima when she's having a drink next door. It might be better to do a consultation response. But thank you very much indeed to our panel for their wonderful insights. Thank you, Purnima, if I can say, for being a very good sport, if I can put it that way. And putting yourself in the lion's den, I think showed great moral courage. So thank you indeed. And please, a round of applause for our panel.